If you have been with us over the last several weeks, you know that we've been walking through a teaching series from the Bible called Created on Purpose. And the whole aim of this teaching series, if you haven't been with us, is to ask the question, as Christians, is there truth about who we are? What is our identity? What does it mean to be human? What does the Bible say about that? And that's really the question we've been answering through this whole series, and we've been doing it by sort of walking through what we would call the Bible's storyline, or the big story of the Bible. And so, for the sake of a quick review, and I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, to listen to our podcast or to watch some of the previous teachings that are on YouTube or on our Boxcast channel, and they'll fill it in certainly better than this. But we were reminded at the very beginning that we as human beings are created by God. Exactly how that all happens, we're not exactly sure, but we know that God creates us with intentionality. That is, that you're distinct and unique, and you are, God would speak of you as His perfect craftsmanship. That means that every single human being has inherent and indisputable value, and we should treat each other that way. But we're not just created by God, we're created by God for purpose. That is, that God, in creating us, created us for a reason. And in the opening chapters of the Bible, we learn about those reasons. There are really two big reasons. The first is to fill the earth, right? That is, that so that in so much as humanity fills the earth, we take the image of God that's in us and we put it on display for all the world. And the God says humanity also has been given a really special role to have in all of creation. We're actually to cultivate that creation, right? The Bible language uses words like rule and subdue. We soften that language because when the Bible uses rule and subdue, they mean rule and subdue as God would rule and subdue, not as harsh humans tend to rule and subdue things. So cultivate. Help creation become all it's supposed to be. When I use the word creation, I'm not just talking about plants and flowers and trees, right? They're in it too. I'm talking about all of this whole thing that we experience in this world. And so that's our role, but because we can't help but get in our own way, right? The church uses the word sin. We just, by that mean, instead of being image bearers of God, we would rather be like God. We'd rather have the power. We'd rather rule and control and subdue on our terms, as opposed to doing it for God and for His glory. And it creates all kinds of problems in our world. We said that every single relationship in creation is damaged because of our rebellion. Our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with others, our relationship with God, and our relationship with the created world, all left utterly damaged. So what does God do in the midst of that? Well, because God is everything we read about in Psalm 145 earlier, He steps right back into the midst of that in Jesus in order to redeem it and set it back to its original intention. And so, at the core, if you would call yourself a Christian, you are a redeemed creation of God, set back to your original identity and purpose because of what Jesus has done for you, defeating sin and death in the cross and through His resurrection. The Bible uses the word adoption to make sense of that. And so in essence, though we've set ourselves free from God's own family in our rebellion, God has welcomed us back as His sons and daughters. And then last week we said, as adopted sons and daughters, that means that we are heirs, that we get the full inheritance of God. The full bounty of God is bestowed on us. That does not mean material blessings or massive bank accounts or any of the things that some people corrupt it to mean. What it means is we have full access to God Himself. God has made Himself available to us completely and wholly. And we have access to have relationship with the created world like we were always intended to. we experience this in what we call the already but not yet, right? We taste it, but we don't have it in its fullness yet until Jesus sets all things right when he returns. But we live in light of that inheritance. It's like this, right? If you knew that a massive inheritance awaited you, right? Think about an inheritance beyond what you could ever imagine. Think that one of your relatives is on the Forbes top 100 most rich people list, right? And it's all coming to you. It would change how you live now, would it not? You would worry less about certain things, and you would invest more in other things. And the call to Christians in this world now is that we live in light of the inheritance that we have. And at its core, what has happened here is that through Jesus, we've been invited to once again embrace those two purposes for our existence. Do you remember them? To fill the earth for the glory of God, and to cultivate creation to be all that God intended or intends it to be. Jesus invites us in Him, in new community with Him, in the family of God with Him, to be after and about those two things. And so you say, rightly, okay, seems super esoteric, kind of out there, a little weird, but I'm with you. How do we do it? Well, I'm glad that you asked. We have 3 weeks left in this series, and over these next 3 weeks, we're going to tease out how we do that. How, in light of Jesus, do we get back to how we were created to do, who we were created to be, even though we don't live in the Garden of Eden, we live in the Garden of Bethlehem, or Nazareth, or Macungie, or Emmaus, or Allentown, or wherever you're coming from. How do we do that in our world, in this day, 2023, 2024, and moving forward? And the New Testament really gives us several different words that are identity statements that really ought to frame how we live our lives. So the identity we want to focus on today is the identity of priests. That God calls us His priests, or He calls His church a priesthood. He would even call them a royal priesthood. So, if you have a copy of the Scriptures, you can turn to 1 Peter chapter 2. If not, no worries. We always have the verses on the screen so you can follow along. So you can follow along, and so you can be certain that I'm not making it up. 1 Peter 2, verse 9. But you, Peter writes, are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives amongst the pagans or the Gentiles that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day He visits us. Okay. Let me set some context to this so we can even begin to try to understand what's going on. So, the guy who's writing this letter is a man named Peter. You may have heard of Peter before if you've been around the church for any length of time. Peter was one of Jesus' disciples. And Peter had a special task from Jesus to really make the gospel of Jesus known specifically to Jewish people, though he also is going to do it to people who aren't Jewish. So Peter, in his Jewish faith, is deeply concerned with making sense of Jesus in light of his faith. And so, in this verses that we just read, he's quoting a whole bunch of verses from what we would call the Old Testament, but for Jewish people, what they would call their Bible, right? and he's helping them understand who Jesus is and therefore who they are in light of what the Old Testament has always been pointing them towards. Now, it's also really important to understand a couple of things. That Peter, when he's writing this letter, is writing it to a group of people who are kind of scattered about. It's what we would call a diaspora. Does that word make sense, right? Kind of think about remember when you were a kid and you'd pick a dandelion that had kind of died and had all those white things on the top, and you'd blow it and they would just go everywhere? That's who Peter's writing to. So it's not just like a single church that's gathered together, but it's people who are kind of all over the place around the Roman Empire and who are scattered about. And he's reminding them that even though they're scattered, they're still the church, and because they're the church, they have a really important identity, and because they have that identity, they can have renewed purpose in their lives. So, on the basis of that, I want to help us understand what it means to take up this identity as priests in our world. How do we do that? I think there are 5 things that pop off the pages of these verses for me that are helpful. So you ready for this? I'm going to say it real quick, and you're going to be like, man, that guy's super smart. Then you'll realize I had to sound super smart, and then we'll make sense of it, right? So in essence, Peter is saying this: the church is a diasporic, worshiping, mediating, exemplary collective. Wow. That's impressive, isn't it? At least I impressed myself. Those are the 5 words. Now let's make sense of them in regular human language, not words, right? Diasporic, so scattered. Is that a better word for us? The very first reality of priesthood is that it is necessarily scattered. Right? And this is really helpful for us, isn't it? Because it's nice when we gather together on a Sunday morning like this, and there's a reason for that, so we can be reconnected to each other, recharged, recentered on the gospel. But my guess is where you're going throughout the rest of this week, there are lots of people who believe lots of different things around you, right? We're scattered in most of our existence. We're not huddled up in one place. Peter's writing to exactly that kind of people. And here's what I want you to know, because sometimes it can be overwhelming to us, that it is actually God's intention that his church is scattered more than it is gathered. Think about that for a minute. It's actually God's intention that his church is scattered more than it's gathered. We can go all the way back to those very first 2 realities of the purpose of humanity. And what was the first one? To fill the earth. Now, how on earth, pun not intended but delivered, how on earth do you fill the earth without scattering? It can't be done, can it? Because if we all huddled in one place, we would never be able to fill the earth, right? But God's intention was always for this movement to multiply and for people to go so that his glory, the truth about who he was put on display in new places for new people to see and for new people to understand. God's expectation was never that people would come of their own accord and try to figure it out. That happens sometimes, praise God for that. But ultimately that his people would understand that central to their identity, central to our existence, is to go so that people can see who God actually is, and not some made-up characterization of him that the world or they themselves have concocted. This is so true. Think about this with me for a minute. Maybe you're familiar with this story, maybe not. Do you remember how the church started after the resurrection of Jesus? There's a big holiday in the Jewish calendar called Pentecost. And on that day, Peter, this very guy here, preached a sermon, right? Now, it must have been a super good sermon, right? Or else God is super big. We'll go with the second, even though the sermon probably was pretty good. And it said that thousands of people were so moved by the sermon that they gathered together and believed the truth that Jesus had died for them and was raised from the dead and changed everything. And it created this big hunk of people. And it said that every day more people were connecting to them, connecting to them, connecting to them. But God's purpose was never simply that there would be a representation of Him in Jerusalem, where this was happening. His purpose was what? That they would fill the earth. So do you know what God allows to happen in the book of Acts? He actually allows what's called persecution to begin happening in the church, so that people are coming and opposing what they're doing, even in a violent way, because it's the persecution that actually moves the people to go back where they came from, to start filling the earth, to start being on mission with God again and doing it. Peter was a central leader in this reality. He understood this after the fact. And therefore, when he's writing this letter years later, reflecting upon it, he's understanding that this diaspora, this scattered reality, is actually central to God's mission, that His people would fill the earth, so that they don't have to find their way to Jerusalem to figure out who God is. They can meet it in their own town, Antioch or Ephesus or Philippi or Colossae, or modern day language, Bethlehem or Bethlehem Township or Allentown or Parkland School District or Nazareth or Makunji or Emmaus. Right? If people had to find their way to Spring Garden on a Sunday, we're not doing the thing God called us to. Priests are naturally scattered so that God can be seen. Now, what's fascinating to me at the core of this is the very first thing that Peter says, right? You are a royal priesthood. He says, to declare the praises of the One. I love this, isn't it? Because priests, by their nature, are going into, think about it in the days that Peter's writing this, or in the Old Testament, a priesthood was a full-on vocation. It was your job. It's what you did. At some level, it might relate to what my job is a little bit different than that, really, though. But Peter wants to remind them, your first job is not to do the business. Your first job is actually to worship. Isn't this fascinating? He says, you are a priesthood so that you will declare the praises of the One. Now think about this with me for just a second. We've said this from the beginning, right? That central to our identity, or central to how we live out our identity, is our relationship with our work. Right? For many of us, we have a love-hate relationship with our work. We love it when it's going good. We hate it when it's going bad. Oftentimes, we love and hate it on the very same day, right? And spouses or best friends or whatever, you've talked to each other about your love-hate relationship with your work. But God has always intended for our work to be a chief means that we do this business of filling the earth and of cultivating His creation. That there's inherent value in every single kind of work. There's not a tiered system. Some isn't better than others. All of it, Martin Luther would say, are ways in which we help fulfill the promises that God has made to His people. So now I want you, as we're thinking this through, to think about yourself. And you have many different functions, right? You might be a parent, you might be a child, you might be a student, you might be all kinds of different vocations. A homemaker, to a doctor, to a teacher, to a pastor, to a craftsman, to graphic design, whatever it is, millions of different vocations. And then you have all other roles, right? You're a friend, you're part of other spheres of influences. So in all these different things, as we process over these next 3 weeks these identity statements, I want you to be thinking, okay, how do I make sense of that in this area of my life? How do I make sense of that in this way? But specifically through your work, so that we're redeeming our work for what it's meant to be. That your work is diasporic, right? It's scattered. It's on purpose. You're not clumped up with people who necessarily believe everything that you believe. That your work is well, this is what I say, right? That the very first thing you should think about in your work is that you are a worshiper first in your work. Now, for many of us, we hear the word worship, we say, well, that's what we just did when we sang those songs. It was weird, but I do it because that's what worship is, right? And I say to you, well, no, that was singing. Worship is the whole of how we live our lives in submission to God. So what would it mean if you thought about your job as a teacher, or your job as a doctor, or your job as a mom, or a dad, or your job in sales, or whatever it is? What if at the start of every workday you simply said this statement to you, I'm a worshiper first? How would that change how you entered in to that reality? Peter's inviting us to it because at the core, our work is worship, and it's significant. Scattered, worshiping. There's a third word, right? Mediating. Now, here's what we're going to do a little bit of reading into what Peter has said here in a helpful way. Because when Peter uses the word priest or priesthood, he knows exactly what he's doing, right? He's not just grasping for an analogy that will make sense or hopefully convey his message. He knew exactly what a priest did, and he's putting that identity on the church, on God's people. And so at the very center of what a priest did in the days of Peter, and in the Old Testament specifically, is a priest mediated between God and humanity. Okay? So think about this with me for just a second. In the Old Testament world, right, in the Jewish backdrop of Peter, when he's writing this and thinking through the new identity in Jesus, he's processing priesthood in the Jewish system. So I don't want to get lost in the weeds, but I want to help us try to understand Peter's thinking here. So central to the whole system of worship in the Old Testament was this massive building in Jerusalem called the temple, right? And the temple was really important because it's where God dwelled. And so Jewish people rightly believed that the temple, and specifically the throne of God or the Ark of the Covenant in the temple, was the place where heaven and earth intersected. And it was the job of the priests to make sure that temple was functioning, right? And to make sure that the people were relating to God and God was relating to the people. In essence, the priests were cultivating the intersection of heaven and earth. Okay? Now listen, that temple is long since gone, destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. There are some people who think the temple needs to be rebuilt. I'm not one of them, because Jesus referred to himself as the new temple. Jesus said, this temple will be destroyed, but it'll be rebuilt in 3 days. He was talking about himself, right? He was crucified on the cross and 3 days later resurrected. So if Jesus is the new temple, then Jesus is the intersection between heaven and earth. Jesus is the only means in which human beings like us are going to have access to God. Then if we are called priests, we're cultivating that connection. Do you see it? We're helping people through Jesus be in relationship to God. We're constantly thinking through two things. First, how do I represent God to the people around me? Massive function of a priest. How do you do that? You do that by how you live your life. You do that by the way you order your life. You do that by the things you say, or the questions you ask, or the prompts that you lead with. But a priest wasn't just about representing God to the people. The priest was also about representing the people to God. The priest brought sacrifices, right? Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. We're not bringing sacrifices. But we are advocating for those around us through prayer, right? Beseeching God for the needs of the people around us. Here's what I want you to see. That in your life, whether you choose to embrace it or not, Whether you say Adam's full of, nonsense, or no, this is truth. I believe that in your life, you are providing access to God for everyone around you through Jesus, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. That God has called you into this priestly role. That in your job, in your parenting, in your citizenship in the town that you live in your interaction with family, in your interactions with friends, you should regularly be thinking about, what does it mean to be a priest? What does it mean to stand, to represent Jesus to this world? Someone once wrote poetically, and there's certainly inherent truth in it, that for most people, the only Jesus they will ever encounter is the one that they see in you and in me. That's a statement of identity as priests. We cannot do what Jesus has done. We cannot be who Jesus is. But we do represent him to the world, and therefore stand in that gap. What would it mean to think of yourself as a priest? Fourth, not just mediators, right? Not just worshipers, but we're exemplary. That is, we are examples. In the ancient world of Peter, everyone knew what a priest was. Why? Because they looked different. Any Seinfeld fans in the room? I'm a huge Seinfeld fan, if you haven't known that about me already. So here's my illustration. It comes from Seinfeld. There's a Seinfeld episode where George, right, one of the main characters, is considering, and ends up doing it, converting to Latvian Orthodoxy. Anyone remember this one? You're already starting to laugh if you remember it. I remember it. And he's doing it because he's dating a girl, and the girl will only allow her parents will only allow her to date someone who is Latvian Orthodox like her. And so George says, well, I'll convert. And so he goes through this whole process, and he's sitting with the priests, and Orthodoxy is kind of very ornate and beautiful, and the priests and stuff wear all kinds of different robes and vestments, and they're asking George, well, what do you like about our faith? And George says, well, I like the hats. The big hats they're wearing. That's as far as my illustration goes. In other words, like, you would know a Latvian Orthodox priest if you passed them that, because they're the hats, right? The hats and the vestments and all the different things. And Peter's in the same thing. Like, in those days, you would know who a priest was. You could identify them by seeing them. Now, that's not so much true in our day, is it? In certain traditions, you could look at a priest by vocation, but remember, Peter isn't saying certain people are priests. He's saying everyone is a priest in this function. Well, Peter's going to do the same thing as the Apostle Paul does. He's going to use this idea of clothing in the language of how we behave, how we order our lives. And so do you see how that section of Scripture that we read together ends? He says, so live such a good life amongst the people that they'll see how you live, and on the basis of how you live, acknowledge that there must be something true about God. Peter actually believes the proposition that simply by living a certain way could actually convince someone that God is real, that God is loving, and that God is transforming our world. That's consequential, isn't it? I'm not certain we believe that, but Peter believed that, and therefore we ought to believe that. That somehow in how we order our lives, in how we decide things, the decisions that we make, the rhythms that we adopt, we actually are putting on display for anyone around us to see who God actually is and what God has particularly done in our lives. The idea is people in your spheres of influence ought to look at you and say, well, they're not like most people I know, right? And not so much because of the clothing you wear, although my wife tells me I have enough holes in my t-shirts that people will be able to identify me from a distance. But because of how you order your life. Why do they make a decision like that? That's countercultural. Why does that person come to church every Sunday? Isn't there better things to do? I mean, don't you have to start getting ready for the Eagles game at 8 a.m. on a Sunday, not 11:30? Right? Why are they giving away some of their money and being generous to people who are in need? That doesn't make sense. See, in every action we do, we have the opportunity to speak profoundly to the truth of who God is. That's what Peter says, right? As priests, as a royal priesthood, when we're living a certain way, we're actually profoundly impactful. Listen to me, and this is really important. Religion says that you have to behave a certain way in order for God to love you and save you. That's a lie. Don't ever believe it. And don't let anyone tell you it's true. We live a certain way because God loves us, not to get God's love. And that is not just semantics. That's the difference between religion and gospel freedom. What Peter's saying here is God told you have to do these things, so you better do them. Otherwise, he's going to be super angry at you and your life's going to be miserable. That's religion. That's a lie. What Peter's saying here is, hasn't God done something unbelievable for you? And hasn't God, you were rebellious and you just dismissed his whole family and you went and did your own thing and you found yourself in all kinds of mess. But God said, and I love that person. I'm coming for that person. And Jesus entered into all of it. The full penalty that was ours to be paid, Jesus has paid for us all. It's all dealt with. It's done for. Sin, death, defeated. This is who God is. Hasn't God done that for you? If so, aren't you free to live a different way? That's what Peter's saying here. And in fact, not only are you free, but when you do, it actually puts the story on great display for everyone else to reckon with. Now think about this. If people are looking at your life and the first thing they think is, well, he or she is just like everyone else, that's a missed opportunity. That's a missed opportunity to live into your identity as a priest. Think about that as you conduct yourself at work, right? In the break room, when everyone's grumbling about everything, right? It's not just your job, by the way. I've been in multiple break rooms around the world. They're all grumbling about their job. No one's happy about it, right? Now, in my break room, I'm super happy about my job, but just kidding. Every once in a while, I grumble about my job too. Trust me. Or are you processing, is this a moment where I can be different? Where I can actually redeem my identity, not through what the world says, perform, produce, or you're no good at what you do. No, I'm a worshiper. God has called me into this role, whatever it is, so that I can help deliver on his promises to the people around me. I get it. You're like a fish swimming against the current when you do that. It's like being in a diaspora, isn't it? Scattered. No one around you is living like that. But when you do, all of a sudden, lights come on. Something's different. Why is it that way? What does that mean? Why is that person wearing that weird hat? Right? This is the kind of life we're called to. And you say, but there's so much at stake. Yeah, it kind of is, isn't there? And that's where I say to you, are you certain about your inheritance or not? Because if you're not, then you got to live for today. Get as much as you can now. But if you're certain that the inheritance of God is yours, then you can swim upstream. Right? You can parent differently than the world tells you have to. You can work differently. You can choose differently. You can steward your finances differently. You're free to do all those things. The chains are released from you. And it's a beautiful and wonderful thing. Last point. Collective. Did you notice that Peter calls the collective audience of this letter a priesthood? It's super important. It's not just semantics. He doesn't say, well, you, and you're the priests. And this group over here, you're just the people who sit in the seats, right? He says, everyone is priests. It's collective. It's necessarily plural. It's necessarily all-inclusive. In the same way that the priesthood in the Old Testament was collective and plural. Why? Because you could never hope to do this on your own. The life I've just proposed to you is unsustainable in isolation. Though you are scattered, every once in a while, you've got to come together and read 1 Peter. And remember, there's actually more of us than it feels like on Tuesday. There's actually more of us than it feels like on Friday. And we as a church have to pause and remember, there's actually more of us than the couple hundred that gather in Nazareth and Bethlehem every Sunday. There's actually churches all across the world who are trying to do the same thing. We're scattered. We can't all be together. But there's power and there's sustenance in that reality. It's like having a big enough band that you have confidence to play your instrument and know you're going to hit some wrong notes, right? Because no one's going to hear the wrong notes because the band is going to carry the day. Right? Imagine that. The power that comes in that. But you only gain that kind of sustenance if you're in. If you're living in isolation, then it kind of all falls on your shoulders at some level, doesn't it? And you've got to work up the power to do it on your own. Hey, it's for all of these reasons, all 5 of them, that we have structured our church the way that we do. You might say, it's kind of weird. Hope Alliance is a weird church. You don't do a whole lot of things, do you? Sunday morning and community groups and almost nothing else. Why? Because we actually believe we're intended to be scattered. We actually believe we're intended to live amongst people who are far from God and who need to know who God is. That's part of being the church. It's not additional or separate. Fascinating. And you actually don't want to just build one big church where everyone comes to. No, we actually would like to have like 10, 15, 20, 25 congregations across the Lehigh Valley. Why? Because we're supposed to be scattered. We're supposed to be in communities where people can actually see people living a different way. Not just have to drive in on a Sunday to experience it. No, we're not there yet. We're on a journey together. That journey is what we call a mission. We're a bunch of priests trying to do this together. Last call. So we need you. Because we can't do it together. Or we can't do it together. Oh, what a missed opportunity. We can do it together. We can't do it alone. We need you. We need you to be here on Sundays. Not to check boxes, not to have perfect attendance, not that you don't have other things going on in your life. We get it. You're going to miss a Sunday here and there or multiple, whatever it is. Not because we believe that you need us, but because we believe that we need you. Think about that for a change. So much of the church's message is, you need us, you need us, you need us, you need us. That's not the message of faith. The message of faith is we need each other. We're desperate for each other if we're going to live into this call that God has given us. And it's why we do community groups. If you're not part of one, man, could I encourage you to think deeply about it. Because it's in community groups where people are learning more deeply what it means to live into these identities and they're building deeper connections to each other so that they're empowered to stand in truth. Can I pray with you? God, we live in a world that is constantly broadcasting, speaking, displaying messages about what it means to be human, what our purpose is, who we are, what we belong to. Typically, it's all about producing, performing, or status. We reject that in your name this morning. Instead, help us to live into the identity that you've given us. Set us free from these chains and traps. Lord, in the coming days, in the coming weeks, as we go to work, as we parent our kids, as we live as kids in a household, as we interact with our friends, colleagues, neighbors, as we think about what does it mean to be a parent? What does it mean to be a neighbor? What does it mean to be an employee? What does it mean to be working at the job I'm at? Would one of our questions regularly be, God, how are you calling me to be a priest in this role? Scattered though it may be, worshiping first, cultivating the truth of Jesus, mediating between God and man, living as an example for a watching world, and doing it together as part of this community of faith. Amen.